He said the voices told him to do it, but the voices were his own. And by the time police caught him, 14 women were already gone. Kansas City's dark streets had never known such terror. Behind every corner, there was the shadow of a predator stalking his next victim. A killer who seemed untouchable, a monster who blended into society with ease. But by the time authorities caught up with him, his reign of terror had already scarred the city forever. His name, Terry Blair. As we delve into this video, don't forget to like this video, share with friends, and subscribe to Murder Files for more delve into true crime cases.
In the early 2000s, Kansas City was plagued by a series of disturbing disappearances. Women, vulnerable women, were vanishing without a trace. They were mothers, daughters, sisters. Some were struggling with addiction, others with the scars of past abuse. Some worked as sex workers, trying to survive in a world that often looked the other way. One of the first victims to disappear was 22-year-old Chandra White. She was last seen walking down a familiar stretch of road, just a few blocks from where she had spent the night with a friend. But she never made it home. Days later, her body was found, dumped in a rundown alley, her life stolen in the blink of an eye. Then there was Lisa Harris, a 30-year-old mother of two. Lisa had a troubled past, but she was working hard to rebuild her life. She had dreams of one day opening a small business. But on one fateful evening, she stepped out to meet a friend and never returned. Her body was discovered in a secluded area, miles from where she was last seen. The police were stumped. No witnesses, no evidence, just another lost soul swallowed by the city. As the months passed, more bodies turned up and a chilling pattern began to emerge. The women were all between the ages of 20 and 40. They had been strangled, dumped in abandoned lots or along remote highways. They were mostly women of color, marginalized by society. Some had been sex workers, others had fallen on hard times, but all had one thing in common: they were vulnerable. The community was terrified. The police were baffled. The killings were brutal and swift, but the killer seemed to vanish without a trace. No one knew who would be next, but one thing was certain: the killer was watching, waiting, and striking when least expected. Kansas City, a city that once felt safe, now felt like a hunted town. The darkness seemed to be closing in with every passing day. The pattern of the killings grew more evident, but the fear was even more pervasive. A killer had found his prey, and he was only getting started. Little did the city know, the man responsible for the horrors haunting them was someone they'd never suspect. A man who blended seamlessly into society. A man who would become known as the Butcher of Black River.
As the months passed and more women vanished, a whisper of fear began to spread through the streets of Kansas City. A quiet panic began to take root, but it wasn't until the discovery of a fourth body that the police started to take the mounting suspicion seriously. It was the middle of October when the body of 31-year-old Tanya Evans was found in a field near Black River Parkway. Her body had been left in plain sight like the others, but there was something different about this one. For the first time, a witness came forward. A local resident who had been walking his dog along the parkway that morning saw a dark figure leaving the area. The witness had no description of the man, just a fleeting impression of a shadow in the distance, but it was enough to send the investigation into motion. Detectives quickly connected the murder to the earlier disappearances. At this point, they had a chilling realization. These weren't random killings. there was a method to the madness. The killer was targeting women, but not just any women. They were women who lived on the fringes, women society had largely ignored, women who no one would notice missing until it was too late. The media, once dismissive of the disappearances, finally began to pick up on the story. Headlines flashed across the front pages. Killer targeting women in Kansas City. Is there a serial killer on the loose? The city was in full panic mode, and the police were scrambling to keep up. With each new victim, the details of the case seemed to follow a predictable pattern. Women who had been strangled and left in remote locations. The bodies were showing up along the same stretches of highway, abandoned lots, and alleyways. But the police were still at a loss for concrete evidence. No DNA had been left behind, no fingerprints, no trace of the killer. It was as though he had vanished into thin air after each crime. The task force dedicated to the case grew larger, but still they were met with dead ends. Witnesses couldn't provide much beyond vague descriptions, and the community began to turn against the authorities. Frustration set in, and the public demanded answers. Meanwhile, a disturbing theory began to circulate. Was the killer someone local? Someone who knew the city's darkest corners intimately? Or was he an outsider, passing through? The question remained unanswered, and the fear only grew. As the months passed with no leads, a sense of helplessness crept in. The women had been forgotten by most of society, their deaths barely making a ripple in the news cycle. But as the cases piled up, the police realized that the killer wasn't just leaving bodies behind. He was leaving behind a message. He was getting closer, and he was becoming more brazen with each kill. By the time authorities began to see a clear pattern, it was almost too late. And when they finally did make the connection, the truth was far more chilling than anyone could imagine. They weren't just hunting for a killer. They were hunting for a man who had already been hiding in plain sight, right under their noses. A man who had been walking among them all along.
Terry Blair was not a man who stood out in a crowd. In fact, he blended into the fabric of Kansas City with ease. To his neighbors, he was just another face, a quiet mechanic who kept to himself. He lived in a modest home in the middle of the city, and during the day he worked on cars, his greasy hands tinkering with engines as if that was the only thing that mattered. Blair seemed like an average guy, someone you'd wave to on the street, someone you might have passed at a local bar or store without ever knowing anything about his dark past. But behind closed doors, Terry Blair was anything but ordinary. His story, like so many of the most chilling killers, began in a childhood marked by violence and neglect. Born in 1961, Blair was raised in a broken home, one where instability reigned. His mother, Janice Blair, was mentally ill and unable to provide any real care for her children. His father, a man who struggled with his own demons, was absent for much of his childhood. Terry grew up in a neighborhood where crime was a part of everyday life, and he quickly learned that survival meant being tough, being hard. From a young age, Blair exhibited troubling behaviors. He had run-ins with the law as a teenager, but they were minor infractions, petty thefts, vandalism, nothing that would have suggested he was a future serial killer. Yet, those closest to him later described a coldness in his eyes, a lack of empathy that went unnoticed at the time. He wasn't like the other kids, laughing and playing in the streets. He was distant, observant, always watching, always waiting. As Blair entered adulthood, his criminal history deepened. He had been arrested several times, mostly for minor charges, but it was his relationships with women that seemed to take a darker turn. He was known to have violent tendencies, a man who used intimidation and fear to control those around him. His relationships were short, turbulent, and often ended badly.
But to the outside world, Terry Blair was just another guy struggling to make a life for himself, quietly fading into the background. He worked as a mechanic, living in the same neighborhood where his victims would later be found. No one ever suspected that the man who fixed their cars and exchanged pleasantries at the local corner store was the same man who had already claimed so many lives. Blair had mastered the art of blending in. He was a man who could walk past anyone without ever drawing suspicion. And that was his greatest advantage. Blair's double life was not only a facade, but a dangerous game he played to keep his true nature hidden. It wasn't until after his arrest that people began to remember the strange behaviors, the offhand comments he had made over the years. Some recalled his obsession with the news reports of missing women, his distant, emotionless stare when discussing the murders. Others noticed how he often hung around the edges of social gatherings, always lurking in the background, never fully engaging. To them, he had always been a quiet man, a bit of a loner, but nothing that would have raised alarm bells. But the truth was, Blair was a predator. And while he blended in with the community, he had already begun his sickening cycle of violence. His method was calculated and precise. He targeted women who were easy to isolate, often those who were marginalized, living on the fringes of society. They were the most vulnerable, and for Blair, that made them the perfect targets. His first known victim was 22-year-old Chandra White, whose disappearance went unnoticed until the body was found. The pattern, however, was unmistakable. He killed to satisfy something dark within himself, an impulse that was impossible to control. Each victim became a trophy, a piece of his twisted game, each death fueling the next. Blair was not an impulsive killer. His murders were planned. He took his time. He stalked, and he waited for the right moment. His victims, like clockwork, were taken under the cover of night, never to be seen again. The brutal, methodical nature of his killings spoke volumes about the predator he had become. He wasn't just killing for satisfaction. He was killing because it was his only way to feel in control, to feel powerful. But no one knew any of this yet. Terry Blair was still just a mechanic in Kansas City, a man whose dark side remained hidden beneath the surface. He was a monster lurking in plain sight, waiting for the moment to strike again. And in the shadows, the city of Kansas City remained unaware that the man who was terrorizing them was right there, in their midst, all along.
Terry Blair's method of murder wasn't spontaneous. It was cold, calculated, and growing ever more sophisticated. As investigators slowly pieced together the pattern, they began to see the horrifying consistency in his attacks, each one an extension of the one before, a deadly escalation of his sick need for control. Blair's primary weapon of choice was simple yet brutal: his hands. The strangulation of his victims was personal. It wasn't just about ending their lives, it was about asserting dominance, leaving behind a mark of control that was impossible to deny. His preferred method was as intimate as it was violent, the tightness of his grip representing not only a physical stranglehold, but a psychological one as well. The act of strangulation allowed him to prolong the moment of death, to savor the power as his victims' lives slowly drained away. The murders started off relatively quick, but as Blair's confidence grew, so did his cruelty. By the time he had claimed his fourth victim, he had already begun to experiment. The bodies, once left unceremoniously in the dark corners of Kansas City, started to display signs of ritualistic behavior. With each victim, Blair seemed to refine his methods, adding more gruesome touches to his killings. He began to stage the bodies after death, arranging the victims in poses that made them appear almost lifelike. Some were left with their eyes wide open, staring blankly into the void, as if trapped in their final moments of terror.
Others were placed in awkward positions, contorted in ways that twisted the very nature of their deaths into something grotesque, something that seemed to mock their final cries for help. To Blair, these post-mortem displays were trophies, evidence of his power over life and death. His killings also grew more brazen. Whereas his first few murders had been committed in dark alleys or abandoned lots, Blair began to leave his victims in more public spaces, in areas where people could easily stumble upon the bodies. His latest victim, 30-year-old Lisa Harris, was found in a park just off a busy street. She was discovered lying in a patch of tall grass, her body arranged unnaturally on display. It was a chilling reminder that Blair was becoming more comfortable, more confident with each kill. With each death, Blair took more risks, yet he never left behind a clue that could link him directly to the murders. He was meticulous in covering his tracks. No DNA, no fingerprints, no trace of his presence beyond the bodies themselves. The forensic evidence was frustratingly sparse, leaving the police with little more than the victim's final, tortured expressions. But perhaps the most disturbing element of Blair's modus operandi was the choice of victims. They were often women who lived on the fringes of society. Many were sex workers or women struggling with addiction, easily overlooked by a world that dismissed their worth. But to Blair, they were perfect, vulnerable, isolated, and easily controlled. His crimes were not only about death, but about power, the ability to dominate and control those who had already been forgotten. Blair's growing confidence in the escalation of violence marked the beginning of a dangerous new chapter in his killing spree. He was no longer just a man hiding in the shadows. He was now playing a twisted game, taunting both his victims and the police. The brutality of his crimes grew with each passing day, and the fear he instilled in the city of Kansas City seemed to multiply with every new victim. The police, desperate for answers, began to notice another disturbing trend. The killings were becoming more reckless. He was not hiding in the shadows anymore. He was leaving his mark, demanding to be noticed. The growing intensity of the murders suggested that Blair wasn't just killing to satisfy a dark urge. He was doing it to prove something, to himself, to the world, or perhaps to the very people who were hunting him. His pattern was no longer subtle. It was bold, dangerous, and leaving a trail of blood that would be difficult to ignore. Blair was slipping. Perhaps not yet enough for the police to catch him, but enough to make it clear that the end was near. But for now, he remained at large, lurking in the shadows, waiting for his next victim.
As the bodies continued to pile up, Kansas City was gripped by an overwhelming sense of dread. The police force, already stretched thin, was under immense pressure to catch the killer before another life was lost. Detectives worked around the clock, sifting through evidence, conducting interviews, and following up on every lead that came their way. But despite their efforts, the killer seemed to be one step ahead, evading capture at every turn. The turning point in the investigation came when forensic evidence finally provided a potential breakthrough. A small, almost overlooked piece of evidence was found at the scene of one of Blair's earlier murders: a single strand of hair. Initially, the hair was dismissed as inconclusive, but forensic experts managed to extract DNA from it, something that hadn't been possible in the earlier cases. The breakthrough sent shockwaves through the department. They now had a tangible lead. But there was a catch. The DNA didn't match anyone in the police databases. The killer wasn't a known criminal. Not yet, anyway. The lack of a match sent the investigation down a frustrating path, where the evidence seemed to only deepen the mystery. The killer's DNA was there, but it didn't belong to anyone they could identify, at least not yet.
As the investigation dragged on, surveillance footage taken from nearby businesses became an essential tool in the hunt for the killer. Grainy images from street cameras began to show a man in his late 40s with a scruffy beard and a nondescript appearance. He was seen near the locations where several bodies had been found, but the footage was too blurry to make a positive ID. There were no distinctive features, no obvious connections between this man and the murders. The detectives turned to the community for help, asking for tips and any information that might lead them to the killer. An anonymous tip came in through a local hotline, suggesting that the killer might be someone familiar with the city. The caller mentioned that they had seen a man matching the description near several of the crime scenes and that he had acted strangely when approached by passersby. The tip was vague, but it was enough to narrow down their search to a local resident. As they combed through neighborhood records, they came across an interesting name: Terry Blair, a mechanic who had lived in the area for years with no criminal record to speak of. His name hadn't come up during initial searches because he wasn't a suspect. He was just another member of the community, one of the many faces in Kansas City's sprawling urban landscape. But something about Blair seemed to stick in the detectives' minds. His name appeared again and again in witness reports, and his face seemed to be in the background of surveillance footage. Detective Mark Larson, who had been leading the investigation from the beginning, couldn't shake the feeling that Terry Blair was the man they were looking for. But there was no concrete evidence to back up his suspicion. The DNA didn't match, and there was no hard proof that Blair had been at the scenes of the murders. The case had turned into a frustrating game of cat and mouse. The breakthrough came when a new tip from a local woman came in. She had worked with Blair years ago at a nearby car shop and described him as a quiet, seemingly harmless man who kept to himself. However, she mentioned something unusual. Blair had often expressed a strange, almost obsessive interest in women who had been reported missing. He seemed to know a lot about their personal lives, sometimes even before the police released information to the public. She couldn't remember any specific incidents, but she found it odd at the time. This new piece of information, combined with the fact that Blair had been seen near the crime scenes, was enough for the police to move forward with a closer look at his life. They started to pull records, including employment history, financial details, and any interactions he might have had with women who could be considered vulnerable. What they discovered was chilling.
Blair had been living alone for years. His criminal history was a blank slate. No prior convictions, no known involvement with the law outside of minor traffic violations. He had lived in the same house for nearly a decade, working as a mechanic and blending into the community. But as the investigation continued, it became clear that Blair was far from the harmless mechanic he appeared to be. A pattern of suspicious behaviors emerged, a history of short, volatile relationships with women, a series of odd comments about the murders, and a disturbing lack of emotion when discussing missing persons cases. The investigation was beginning to close in on Blair, but there was still one crucial piece missing: definitive proof that he was the killer. Forensic teams worked tirelessly to match his DNA to the evidence found at the crime scenes, but it wasn't until they discovered a critical mistake that the case would take a dramatic turn. Blair had made one fatal error. In his rush to cover his tracks, he had overlooked one key detail, one that would soon lead the police right to him. It wasn't the DNA alone that would bring him down, nor the blurry surveillance footage. It was the small, careless mistake that would prove to be his undoing.
And soon, the police would have all the evidence they needed to finally capture the man who had terrorized Kansas City for far too long.
Terry Blair's capture was almost anticlimactic. One evening in late 2005, police raided his home after a fresh tip-off from a former associate. They found him at his modest house, calm and unassuming, with no signs of panic. Blair's arrest was swift, but his cold demeanor during questioning shocked everyone. He showed no remorse. At trial, Blair's psych evaluation revealed a chilling indifference to his crimes. He confessed to 6 murders, but his list of victims was suspected to be far higher. The courtroom felt suffocating as families wept. Blair's emotionless silence spoke volumes. He was sentenced to life. Blair's sentencing didn't provide the closure the victims' families had hoped for. While he was imprisoned, the city of Kansas City was forever marked by his crimes. The community, once naive to the danger lurking within their own streets, now had to face the uncomfortable reality that a predator had been hiding in plain sight. The psychological scars were deep, and the trauma persisted. The case led to a review of investigative practices, especially regarding vulnerable populations. Blair's story also became the subject of countless documentaries, books, and discussions, ensuring that the victims' names would never be forgotten. If you found this story chilling and compelling, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Stay tuned for more gripping true crime documentaries every week. Don't miss out on the latest investigations and unsolved mysteries, because the truth is always lurking just beneath the surface.